Hi, I am Miriam Rasch. I'm a philosopher and essayist working at the Willem de Kooning Academy in Rotterdam. And I'm very happy to be here today to talk a little bit about my research into data and ethics. So why do data and ethics have such a troubled relationship? That's basically the big question that I sought to answer in my book, Frictie, Ethiek in tijden van Dataisme, or Friction, Ethics in Times of Dataism, which came out last year at the Dutch publishing house, De Bezige Bij. So I'm very happy to talk about some ideas from the book here today. And I want to start by recalling two questions that kind of set me on track of writing and researching, and that just kept on nagging me. And the first has to do with these popular stories about data and algorithms that supposedly know everything and anything better than we humans could possibly do. And I have two examples. One article states that Facebook data know you better than your own mother, of course, based on your Facebook likes. And the other example is a superstar historian, Yuval Noah Harari, who says that algorithms are able to know you better than you know yourself. And that makes us into vulnerable and hackable animals, as he calls it. And while such statements are often eagerly accepted by many people, you don't have to be overly philosophical to ask some skeptical questions, I think. Most importantly, what is knowing here? What does knowing mean? It probably refers first and foremost to predicting my buying behavior. One of Harari's own famous examples is that an algorithm could be able to predict your sexual orientation before you are aware of it yourself. But why would that suggest that it knows me better than I know myself? That would reduce knowing and knowledge to the determination of certain characteristics. And why presume that such characteristics can be so easily defined and delimited in the first place? And that knowledge, and let alone self-knowledge, wouldn't also entail some kind of reflection or relationship to these categories that affect us. So that was the first question. And the other question that concerned me is about ethics. Because why do these so-called all-knowing algorithms and the companies and regulators that use them consistently lead to such unethical decisions or outcomes? So even after the revelations of Edward Snowden in 2013, we needed Cambridge Analytica to really realize the amount of greed and manipulation and hubris, actually, that data are able to sustain. And while tech companies often promise to better themselves, at least they promise so on the surface, it never works out. Their ethic boards seem decorative at most, toothless, and their pledges to do better really fall into a bottomless pit, you could say, as soon as a press release is sent out about it. So something is seriously amiss when it comes to ethics and data. And why is that? There is an obvious answer. Data function in the context of capitalism, and they are very good at it too. Convincing your users that you know them better than they know yourself is very good advertisement for your product. It gives a sense of security if it would happen to be true. And skeptic as we may be, we also really like to believe in these dreams that are projected by advertising. So basically, ethics is not a good match with money making. It calls for careful deliberation, takes up precious time. It means juggling with concepts such as human dignity, which can't be sold, and purpose, which can't be bought. Data are meant to make money, and to that end make processes as efficient as possible. Ethics, on the other hand, hold up the process of money-making and efficiency. Hence, ethics doesn't sit well with CEOs and CFOs and politicians with short-term interests and a tight budget. So ethics, we could say, cause friction in a process that is supposed to run as smoothly as possible, and thus generating as much profit as possible. But I think the problem actually runs deeper than that, and that data, or let's say the dogmatic belief in the good of data that is called Dataism, somehow precludes an ethical standpoint altogether in the way that data or Dataism views and deals with the world. There seems to be this fundamental tension between ethics and data, and it has to do, first and foremost, with the nature of data themselves. So while data are not in themselves bad or wrong or even new, it is this dataist belief that the world in its entirety can be translated into data where things get murky. And it's this belief that has really grown immensely and without many checks and balances in the 21st century, and which is starting to show all these detrimental effects like ethnic profiling and polarization, radicalization, spread of fake news, you name it. So to understand why Dataism and ethics do not sit together well, we first need to take a closer look at what data are and do. Because in all the talk about data, it is rarely talked about what we talk about when we talk about data. And that, I think, is where the trouble starts in the first place. So there's no such thing as raw data, is an old saying by now, but it's rarely understood in its immediate impact. At least not by the people and institutions who are buying and using and putting their trust in data, so like the clients of the data industry. If you look up data online, you get a pretty good picture of how data is generally perceived. It has to do with numbers that float around in ordered structures, free of any relation to the concrete world, in a dark sea that is shot through with these blue lights. Of course, that signals objectivity and neutrality and transparency. It also has this tinge of mystery and impenetrability. Those are all pretty interesting contradictory signals, by the way. But obviously, this idea of free-floating data that are neutral zeros and ones is false, because there's no such thing as raw data. Means that data are always a representation. You can't go out into the street and pick up crumbs of data because they're simply not there. They're not out there floating around in this blue light. And you could try to open up my chest and go looking for my political or religious convictions, but you won't find them there. To make sure that such data are collected, you first have to make an effort. You have to build an infrastructure, make databases, ask questions, define categories, and so on and so on. But in Dataism, this representation is made into a universal. So data are seen as this universal code with a universal application. There's no escaping it. And of course, that is the reason why these data would know you better than you know yourself. But still, there are these steps, several steps to be taken before such data as we think we know them become what they are. They are the result of many choices and with selection mechanisms that are in process. What and who is deemed relevant? What expectations do we have when we encounter the world? And how are these made discrete and present and measurable? And then, after making a selection, the material is translated into code, into certain categories, zeros and ones. And all these steps that lead up to a certain result are usually glossed over when we talk about data. These steps are made invisible. And what remains is this blue sea of so-called neutral data. Fortunately, by now, there is a lot of talk and writing about algorithmic bias and stuff like that. We know how categories are arbitrary, defining and limiting, how they make people up, as Ian Hacking says. But collecting even more data or using even more refined categories will not help, because it won't change these mechanisms that are at work, in which the representation is fundamentally mistaken for a universal. So first of all, we need to acknowledge that all data are a translation or an interpretation of the world out there, and that bias is inevitable, just as it is when we view the world ourselves with our eyes and our own perspectives. And I think that dataism occurs when such reservations are let go. Even while data profiles are often formed of estimates and offer a probability of something that is never 100%, for example, of your political or sexual orientation. In dataism, these estimates are treated as definitive answers to very simple questions. They are seen as answering machines that offer clarity and security. And used to make decisions, these decisions are then presented not as the result of a translation or an interpretation leading up to a probability, but as the definitive objective outcome of a rational calculation. And this universality that presents itself as almost natural and that rules out any doubts is what I believe what puts dataism at odds with ethics. So we also need to ask what we talk about when we talk about ethics, because of course there are many, many different ethical theories, and some of them also seek universal principles. In my book, I follow the ethics as described by Simone de Beauvoir in her Ethics of Ambiguity. Sans échec, pas de morale. It's the shortest and most beautiful description of this ethical position. Without failure, no ethics. So what does that mean? Ethics, in this understanding, is not the answer to a certain problem or dilemma. It exists rather in the search for an answer to a dilemma. So you find yourself in a situation with all its complexity, all its uniqueness, and you have to make a decision, and the clock is ticking, and that is where ethics originates. Not in the sense that your ethical deliberation will lead to a definite choice or answer that is the perfect solution to this situation at hand, and that will leave everyone satisfied and wiser. It is in the clash of values and options and possibilities that something like ethics is constituted in the first place. And that means that theoretically, best options may be possible, but practically, ethical dilemmas are always tragic. Someone will suffer, and probably everyone will suffer in some degree or another. Take, for example, the most famous ethical dilemma, the trolley problem, as designed and described by Philippa Foot in the 60s. A bunch of people is tied to the tracks, and there's this wayward trolley that is storming at them. What will you do? Will you leave them there? Will you pull a lever? Or will you push the innocent bystander over the railing in front of the trolley, thus sacrificing the one to save the many? However you choose, and even if everyone agrees with you, and even if the persons who will lose their lives agree with you, the ending will be tragic. And this is not just a theoretical discussion. I think if you look at discussions that happened in the COVID-19 crisis around elderly people who, according to some, and even to some elderly people themselves, were supposed to accept their lethal fate in the pandemic. Values and interests collide without there being a 100% correct answer. And presuming that something could be either good or bad, a yes or a no, a 0 or a 1, in this sense would be totalitarian. I also believe that such an ethics of ambiguity brings back ethics to us personally and to our interpersonal relationships. And it opposes this idea that ethics is something that belongs to Facebook or Google or is the responsibility of governments and institutions. I think that's really one of the major misconceptions of ethics nowadays, that it's increasingly thought of only as something that happens in boards and committees, rules and procedures. But it's really not just about privacy regulations or terms and conditions, or even about issues like free speech or breaking up of monopolies, while they are, of course, all very important. Because if the premises of this technology is bad or discriminatory or excluding, ethics won't be able to repair it. Because ethics are not like a corrective checklist that should be applied in hindsight. It belongs to everyone, to you and me, in the here and now. And we should all feel involved in these discussions about values and worldviews, not because I want to put the burden on us, but because I think we shouldn't let companies or commissions be proprietors of meaning and morality. And I really believe that such ethics that is in the hands and hearts of the people using technology or the people who are being used by technology, deserves more attention and appreciation. However, an entangled view of ethics, as it's found in Simone de Beauvoir, also goes to show that an individualistic approach will always fall short. So what you choose never only involves just yourself, but affects multiple others. Just like your data is never just your own, but is always tied in with the data of thousands of millions or even billions of others. And that's also why data claims or concerns should likewise not be treated as individual issues, and responsibilities for it should not be targeted at a single person. Because data, like ethics, are not solipsistic, even if we are often led to believe they are in fact relational. And an ethics of ambiguity approach to dilemmas thus will have to take into account that there's not just one possible answer or one correct answer, but many, many more. And that you can't predict such outcomes or answers with 100% accuracy, because ethics deal with choices and conflicts and clashing values. And taking these away would mean taking away ethical questions or deliberations altogether. And that is also why Simone de Beauvoir, writing in the 1940s, long before Dataism, rages against what she calls a false or inhuman objectivity, this idea that one could accurately represent, calculate, and thus predict the future. Not only is the world so complex and unpredictable that you'd have to make a map of it that covers all territory, and by the time that you're done, the world would be changing again. This false dream of all-knowingness, as she calls it, counters the very heart of what ethics mean and do, or could mean and could do. So it's unrealistic as well, and in practice leads to oppression. On the other hand, ethics as échec or as failure might also sound equally uncomfortable or even painful. But de Beauvoir makes very clear that the openness to failure brings not just agony, but also joy. The uncertainty and complexity of ethical decision-making offers an experience of freedom. It is rich and colorful and exciting, and it's precisely the denial of failure that would be dangerous. So I think the parallel with algorithmic decision-making should be clear, especially when this decision-making is increasingly automated, and so rid of all possibility for choice, conflict, and clashing values, when, in short, it is rid of friction. Automating decision-making means the disposal of ethics itself. And ethics in this understanding might also quite easily just be called friction. And of course, the word friction refers back to this ideal of frictionless design, a design principle that stems from 80s and 90s computing, when it described quite useful and helpful ideas about transferability between appliances and computers, ease of use, and so on. While now it also pertains to making sure that the capture of data through technology never misses a beat, that there's no chance of losing you in the process of making an online order, that there are enough cameras in the street that you can never pass unseen. Friction, I think, may serve as a counterconduct to such practices. First, as a reversal of frictionlessness, as a means to de-automate the capture of data and also the production of ourselves as datafied objects. And next, also as a positive ethical stance in Dataist surroundings. How can this be understood concretely? To close, I want to sketch how friction can be put into practice, or at least one way to do so. I've called data a form of translation, which is inevitably also an interpretation. And such a translation also demands an interpretation of its own, just like numbers never speak for themselves, but need an interpreter to explain what they mean, at least according to this one interpreter. Coming from a literary background, translation to me immediately evokes a whole world of thinking about translation across languages, starting, of course, with the ancient philosophical and religious texts, and moving all the way up to modern poetry. And rather than subscribing to this idea or possibility of being neutral or objective, such translation is considered fundamentally imperfect, incomplete, provisional, always open to discussion, addition, evaluation, and of course, interpretation. And this is made fantastically clear, I think, in the book 19 Ways of Looking at Wang Wei with More Ways by the American translator Elliot Weinberger. And in this book, he examines 19 plus translations of this one 4-line poem by the 8th century Chinese poet Wang Wei, translations into several languages. And I've picked one of the English translations to read here. Deer fence. Empty hills, no one in sight. Only the sound of someone talking. Late sunlight enters the deep wood, shining over green moss again. Translated by Burton Watson, 1971. Even if this poem is just about hills, a voice, sunlight, and moss, translating it turns into quite complicated stuff rather quickly. And the book shows that not only is there always room for one more translation, one different interpretation when it comes to poetry, but also that this failure to reach a definitive translation and the impossibility of a 100% correct rendition is precisely the point. And it's this friction, this imperfection, and the ongoing discussion and improvements that makes the practice of translation beautiful and insightful to begin with. It's where an abundance of knowledge and knowing can be found. So I believe that Dataism, with its hunger for universal coding that will solve all our problems in one automated swoop, could really learn something here. If data present a selection, worldview, story, if they are translation and an interpretation, then other selections and worldviews and stories and translations and interpretations can join. And more so, we should create space for these other ways of looking at, as persons and as institutions. And all this doesn't mean that any story will do, or that any made-up fact deserves space. Interpretation is an act that deals with the world outside. It cannot simply stay within our heads, juggling with private preferences or rationalizing away. It's related to reality, which puts up this form of resistance to what you can say about it. It's not a matter of everything goes. This hermeneutical act or art demands that you respond to the resistance offered by the world. It asks for a dialogue, which can, by the way, also be visualized in a hermeneutical circle. So interpretation, thus, is an art and a competence, though it's not as complicated as translating Chinese poetry. In fact, I think we can all take part in such hermeneutical discussions. And still, the art of interpretation is something to learn and practice. To me, this perspective of hermeneutics, or interpretative dialogues with the world and the other, might even relate to an updated notion of autonomy, the term that has been so very important in the history of ethics, and which has been under fire, and rightfully so, for being a proponent of a very rational, anthropocentric, and individualistic worldview. But I wonder if the notion shouldn't be reappropriated. And I really strongly feel that we shouldn't let leave autonomy to autonomous vehicles, but have something to do with it ourselves, because needless to say also, there's nothing really autonomous about self-driving cars. Even if it's just because autonomy plays this really weird role also in the technological rhetoric, one that must be laid bare. Because on the one hand, we are deemed these hackable algorithms, nothing more than data ourselves, and thus stupid and manipulable. On the other hand, the so-called user is called upon as a rational agent who makes conscious choices about their data and about their consumer choices. So in short, autonomy is this double-edged sword that is always used against us. And rethinking the concept of autonomy, I think, in the context of meaning and hermeneutics, in the context of a relational situated ethics, might give some insight into possible strategies of resistance and refusal or mutual support even. Facebook knows me better than I do myself. My vote is sold off to the highest bidder by data companies. It's not so easy when I take hold of the hermeneutical act and participate in discussion about meaning. And we might call that a form of hermeneutical autonomy or maybe narrative autonomy. It isn't abstract, but rather very concrete and situated ethical position about meaning-making and sense-making, the telling of stories without a pretension of being definite. It departs from friction, which opens up space between one and the other. And I think data can play their part in that, in this deliberation or discussion as a conversation starter or as an intervention, but they will need to learn to be a bit more humble and step down from this position of false unknowingness. Then they will be one in a relation of many, in whose complex and uncertain midst friction opens up spaces and perspectives and experiences, with agony and joy and the notion of what it means to be free together. It's indeed a tricky balance between skepticism towards scientific knowledge or experts, and the need to rely on data, or at least rely on some kind of shared ground that we can depart from. But to be honest, I think what is also going on now is that a lot of the knowledge based on data or like numbers or statistics, it is presented as self-explanatory. So we get a lot of numbers every day that are supposedly without any doubts leading to, for example, certain political decisions or to certain measurements, while it's really not that obvious that one statistic would lead to a certain decision. And it doesn't mean that it doesn't have any, value or ground to start to stand on, but it does mean that also numbers or statistics or data, they really call for an explanation, and this explanation should be based in the numbers or data, and they can't just go anywhere that they want to. But you cannot expect data to speak for themselves and that everyone knows what they mean. And you can also see that in the pandemic, that certain numbers or certain data that is, all countries in the world collect data and numbers about the pandemic, but they do not lead to the same decisions in every country. So, and that's okay, but it really goes to show that such numbers still need someone to interpret it. They need an interpreter. And at the point where you stop offering your explanation or your interpretation and also explaining how your decision relates back to the data, then it's not so strange, I think, that people start becoming skeptic or that they don't put their trust in that anymore. So I would really, a lot of it is about how do you communicate the meaning of such data or statistics. And I think a lot of, in the past year and a half, there has been, we could learn a little bit about it. So to me, the notion of interpretation and meaning and explanation is very important there. But, it can't be built on nothing. It has to be built on the certain facts or figures that you collect from reality. Yes, I think it's indeed very important to point out that also my narrative about data is, biased and comes from my perspective living in the Netherlands in a Western society that is heavily dominated by American technologies, as a large part of the world is, but it's not the whole world where the same circumstances rule, and it's important to kind of point out that perspective as well. And I am reminded, I must say, about the history of statistics and how it all started just with people counting things, and quite soon this counting mania that has also been described, it turned out into a form of control. So where it starts as something of the people, you could say, it very soon becomes something that is part of a power structure. And this might be something that could be countered with the technologies that we have now. I mean, one of the beautiful things, I think, of digital technology is that it still has this potential for emancipation to me. And, I would never want to go back to a time before that because, it has given so many people a chance to, find information or contribute to information and tell their stories and have their voices heard. And I think, we shouldn't forget about this emancipatory character of the internet. So I guess there's also globally many examples of, you know, citizen data projects where citizens collect data and disclose data and use internet technologies to do so. But to be honest, it's not my expertise. But yeah, it's. I think Western history could then still teach us something about where the kind of citizen data or citizen statistics joy turns around into feeding into power structures, and it's important to keep that that in mind, that kind of flipping point. Yes, I think that at least, you know, current day technologies for data are really focused on groups. So you can use data to make calculations and predict, you know, behavior or outcomes of certain individuals, but it is done by comparing the individual to the group. So if you only have data about this one person, it's nothing. You need data about a lot of people on a lot of categories and a lot of characteristics so that you can make comparisons and start predicting, which also harks back to this history of statistics where, you know, it's for example, the mean of a large sample of data it was an invention that was very important, even in thinking about how to handle groups in society. So indeed, it's I think very obvious when you pick an example, for example, how you might not get credit because you live in a certain postal code area. You know, it's because you stand out to your surroundings as potentially, you know, untrustworthy in that sense, that that the decision is made to not, or to give you credit or not. So in that sense, it also means that the fact that you live somewhere affects all your neighbors around you, because everyone is compared to each other when such a decision is coming up and has to be made. And that's why my own decision to say they can know everything about me, or, you know, I don't care, I don't have anything to hide. Well, you might think so, but it means that your decision about your own data really affects everyone around you. And, you know, I'm now talking about postal codes, but that's just your immediate surroundings. And of course, it's really a global phenomenon by now. Friction obviously first came to mind as a kind of alternative stance to data technologies, because it's the flip side of frictionlessness. So this idea that all our technologies should run as smoothly as possible, and that has also to do with automation. So, you know, it's ideally we would be, you know, using our technologies for everything that we do constantly, and it's almost like that. So they're getting there, and friction, to me, it's first and foremost this kind of cog in a machine. So you put your stick in the wheel, and the machine stops, and then you have some time to regroup and regather and reflect. So it's also really something that has to do with time and what I call de-automation. You know, automation is this constant acceleration as well, and if you de-automate, you get time to kind of stand still and think, basically. So that's a really, well, basic concept. What I like about it is that it's also not necessarily in itself ethically good or bad. So you could also say, like, friction can be, you know, like, for example, spreading fake news or trolling online. Is that not a form of friction? I would say, well, you know, the trolls online or spreading fake news is still really using the technologies for gaining, you know, your profits or your ideological growth. But so it's not my kind of friction, but maybe it is a kind of friction. But I kind of like that it's in that sense morally vague, so to speak. And to me, it's also a concept that is all the time still kind of growing in meaning and definitions. And I really like to put it out there and have people take it and do with it as they please. Because, you know, for me, one of the big also, I must say, challenges is to, so I want to oppose this very directive and steering narrative of Dataism, but it also meant to me right from the start that I can't be directive or steering, and I have to leave open, you know, possibilities myself also in my text and in what I'm writing about. And for me, friction is a way of leaving open these possibilities and also saying, like, well, here, take it and do with it what you want, and then still, you know, I can say if I agree or not, but I kind of like that vagueness of the idea. And then I think, lastly, friction for me also really has an artistic side to it. So I already mentioned de-automating ourselves and this notion of de-automation, which, well, could also be, you know, a description of art. It makes you stop and look again and reflect on what you see and break through your automated vision of your surroundings. So this artistic side is also important, I think, in the concept of friction. And it doesn't have to be all, you know, nice and easy and beautiful or aesthetically pleasing. But it's okay if it's a bit against the grain, yeah, which I would also hope art to be.